Evening, friends. I welcome you on your own show, Vaktavya, on my YouTube channel. It is a series of talk show, and today the guest who is joining us in the conversation is one of the most eminent poet of contemporary Indian literature. He's also a critic, translation. Today with us we have Honorable Mr. K. Satchidanandan, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you and welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. Beginning with the questions, I would begin from your childhood. When you wrote your first poem, I want to know what was the state of your mind, and what was the aim of writing that poem, and how you engage in this literature.
Well, I was always a reader of poetry. I mean, even from my childhood. And I wrote my first poem when I was in the sixth class. That I must have been 11 years old at that point of time. That poem was called, in English, we will say dragonflies. You know those flies, but they are not butterflies really, they are not colorful. That rise up from earth when there is a big rain. They are called
Yes,
dragonflies.
yes,
So, and they live, they have only a very short life. They live for a while and then they just lose their wings and fall down and die. So this poem was because this was an everyday sight in Kerala where I lived and where I am living now also. Even though in between I spent 30 years in Delhi. That always I used to wonder why these beings were created because they have such a short life. So this poem was about the brevity of life. The momentariness, the transience. I mean, we live only for a short while. So it was a poem on what can be called mutability, that our lives are very short. Of course, it is not actually a poem which should have been written by a 11-year-old. I should have been writing about birds and bees and butterflies and flowers. But somehow, this poem on death and, the momentariness of life that I happened to write first. Mainly because I was reading a very philosophical kind of poetry at that time. We have a very major poet who is no more, called Kumaran Ashan. And Kumaran Ashan wrote poems about love, also about death. And most of his poems deal with both these, love and death at the same time. And so he had a very profound impact on my imagination, on my thinking, and on my poetry. And I think I wrote that poem under the influence of Kumaran Ashan, the great poet who died before I was born. So maybe. And then I continued writing. I published in school magazines and college magazines, and then later in public magazines. Yes.
yeah. Can you name some of your poets? And you were reading the prose also.
Yes, in fact I was always doing three things at least together. One is writing poetry, second is translating poetry, and the third is writing prose. And the prose is most often literary criticism, but I also sometimes write about social subjects. When there is something that troubles me, when I feel the country is in danger, when I feel that this is not the right kind of politics, this is not the right kind of rulers. So I write about all these when I feel like. I also write philosophical articles. So philosophy, sociology, literary criticism, religion and mysticism. I have written about many different kinds of topics. I have 20 books in prose in Malayalam and about 30 books of poetry in Malayalam. And then there are 5 books of essays in English. And of course, there are so many translations in almost all the languages of India and many languages of the world. Yeah.
At that age of when you were writing your poems at the childhood, what were the things that influenced your poetic consciousness?
Yes, as I said, the poems I had read, they had influenced me very deeply. Because we had poets after Kumar and Ashan, we had poets like Vailopillai Sridhara Menon, P. Kunjaraman Nair, Idasheri Govindan Nair. These you may not be familiar with these poets, but they were some of our best poets. And when I was a boy, these poets, not Ashan was already dead, the other poets were already writing in the magazines I used to read in the library and at home. And I also somehow there was some poetry in my genes, in my instinct, and to develop that poetry, I used to read a lot of poetry. I used to read Malayalam poets. I also used to read poets in translation. Rabindranath Tagore. We have wonderful Malayalam translations of Tagore's poetry, done by G. Shankara Kurup, who was also the first Jnanpith Award winner ever. So Shankara Kurup has made beautiful translations of Tagore's Gitanjali and also Tagore's other poems collected in Ekottara Shati, which means 101 poems, which was a collection of poems chosen by Tagore himself. And Shankarakurup studied Bengali language to translate the poems, and he did direct translation from Bengali. And he also kept all the meter and the rhythm and the rhyme, which were all there in the original. And so these poems sound like the original, and they feel like the original, and they maybe they even surpassed the original, because Shankarakurup was also a really great and talented poet in Malayalam. So Tagore also had deep influence on me, because I got a book by Tagore, the 101 poems, as a prize for a poetry competition when I was in the school. And so then I read other works by Tagore, not only poems, but his novels and plays, which were all translated into Malayalam, and then other contemporary poets. Later, I began also to read in English. When I was in high school and in college, I began to read poets writing in English, not only Indian poets, but also British and American poets, and then European poets who were translated into English. And so my reading grew along with me, and my poetry also grew with that.
Yeah. What, according to you, is being a poet?
Hmm. Of course, it is very hard to define, because poetry does not submit itself to very easy explanations and easy definitions. But I can definitely say one thing: poetry is not essay, poetry is not a short story, poetry is not a novel, poetry is not drama. But poetry can have all these in it, because it can narrate a story, it can be very dramatic sometimes, and it can have conversations like in a play, like in my own poem. You referred to Gandhi and poetry, where Gandhi is in a conversation with poetry. So it can be like, it can have a play within that. It can also be like a film, because there is movement, there are many images in poetry. So it has almost all the arts inside it. It has sculpture, it has painting, it has cinema, it has drama, and it has, of course, music. So it's a combination of all the arts, but uh, none of these arts can be called poetry. Poetry is different from all of them, but can carry all of them, or can contain all of them. So it is essentially a verbal art. It is an art of words, using words in very strange and new orders, give them new meanings, new suggestions. You combine your memory with your experience and with your dream, and there you have poetry. And poetry is a conversation with oneself, a conversation with others, a conversation with nature, and a conversation with the whole universe. That is how I look at poetry mainly. It is a kind of fourfold conversation. Yes.
If I would say that you very well described what is a poem, I want to know what are the elements which make a good poetry.
Yeah, for me, because it may differ from person to person, but for
Yeah.
me, a poem should be fresh. I should feel that I have not read something like this ever before. That's the first feeling I want to get. And so I would call it freshness, novelty, freshness, originality, whatever be the name you give it. And secondly, an element of wonder, because it should surprise you. because it is something that you did not expect. There is something unexpected in that poem, and that unexpectedness comes from the way the poet's imagination works. So imagine inspiration, imagination, of course, training oneself, and finally, language. These are the elements that combine to give you that feeling of surprise. So, freshness and wonder are the two major qualities that I look for in poetry. A poem should look new to me, a poem should also surprise me, fill me with wonder as to how could a poet write like this? How could words speak like this? How could language express itself like this? How could imagination work like this? It only when I begin to be astonished by all these elements in poetry, I feel it is a really good poem. These are the two main qualities. Of course, there are many other qualities. There may be music. There may be, the meaning, the memory, the dream, all those. But finally, if you look at the effect of the poem, these are the two effects I look for. Is it new? Is it something I have never seen before? And does it surprise me? Does it give me a sense of wonder? These are the two qualities I look for in any poem.
Yeah. What, according to you, a poet should have the aim before for writing the 21st century poem, the contemporary literature?
Well, of course, poetry has two things. One is continuity, and the other is originality. T.S. Eliot has an important essay called Tradition and Individual Talent, where he says that a poet belongs to the tradition, but by his individual talent, he also renews the tradition, changes the tradition. So there is a combination of these. A.K. Ramanujan, the great poet and critic in English, of course, he knew also Tamil and Kannada. A.K. Ramanujan used to tell a story. There was a woodcutter, and the woodcutter always would say that the axe he used to cut the wood belonged to his grandfather and grandfather's grandfather and grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. So the other person asked, "Do you think that the cutting part of the axe, that is the blade of the axe, was never changed? Is it not iron? Will it not rust? Will it not get decayed?" Then the man said, "Yes, the blade has been changed many times." Then the other person asked, "What about the handle of the axe?" Then he said, "Yes, the handle is made of wood, so naturally it breaks sometimes, so it has to be replaced. So the blade is different, the handle is different, and yet he would say the axe is the same." And this looks like a humorous story, but there is also a great truth in that. That is, the poem I write is not the poem that Kalidasa or Bhasa or any poet, Valmiki, or any old poet, even a poet like say Sumitranandan Pant or Mahadevi Verma in Hindi, or a poet like Kumaranashan in Malayalam, any of them wrote. At the same time, there is a kind of continuity also, because there is, as I already said about my first poem, there is something of Kumaranashan in my poetry. So there is tradition there, but I change that tradition with my own individual imagination, my talent, my way of using language. And for a 21st century poet, he or she should first of all try to understand the times we live in, the time of violence, the time of war, the time of growing authoritarianism, increasing tyranny and power. And so, first to understand the time, and then to respond to the time through poetry. Only then you become a 21st century poet. And to express that experience, you may have to also reinvent the language. You have to create a language to express this new experience. And it is when that experience and language combine, and both of them belong to our century, we can say it is a modern poem. It is a poem of the 21st century.
Yeah. Are you a poet of first draft, or you change your poem, make change in your poems?
I do. Now, earlier I used to write only with my pen on paper. Now, what I do is I write because of my habit. I don't think it's necessary for everybody, because young people can write directly on the laptop, or even on the mobile or something. But for me, because I'm an old man, so I write my first draft on the paper, and then I copy it to my computer, and then I begin to revise that first draft as many times as I like, and only when I feel okay, now it is somewhat okay, then I make the final draft and send it to a weekly, or for a book, or whatever purpose it serves. So I make many changes in the first draft. Sometimes the last draft may be very different from the first draft. Sometimes it may have only a few differences, and in very few cases, sometimes the first draft remained almost perfect, and I did not have anything to do. But that has happened only in the case of one or two poems. Otherwise, I make many changes in the draft. Yes.
What was your aim behind making such great anthologies like Signatures and many more? And how these anthologies are useful for the new generation of the poets?
Yes, I have been an anthologist all along my career. I have many anthologies in Malayalam, because even now I am editing an anthology of the youngest Malayalam poets, and I have edited an anthology of blog poems in Malayalam. That was some years back, when a lot of young people began to have their blogs and write poetry on the blog. And before that, I edited not one but many anthologies of what I call modern poetry in Malayalam. And then I also edited several anthologies in English. One is what you said, Signatures. It is a collection of Indian poetry, chosen from different languages of India and translated into English. That was done at the suggestion of Arvind Kumar, who was the director of the National Book Trust. Because I was one of the members of the board, and I once complained, Arvind, you have never published a collection of poetry. National Book Trust is not only for publishing, fiction or essays. Why is it that you are so blind to poetry? And then suddenly he got the point, and after 2 days, I got this letter from him saying, "Why don't you edit a collection of modern Indian poetry?" And that was how I edited Signatures, a collection of poetry from many important languages of India, and it carries many important poets. So it has gone into many editions. It has become a very popular anthology of modern Indian poetry. Then I edited something called Gestures, and that was done for the SARC organization. I mean, it was done for the Sahitya Academy, but it was suggested by the SARC. So that is South Asian poetry from the SARC countries, South Asian poetry. And then I edited a collection of world poetry. There are so many collections: Indian poetry, South Asian poetry, world poetry. So I have several anthologies like this in English and in Malayalam. And there is even one in Hindi, which I edited along with Kedarnath Singh, the major poet, who sadly is no more. So we together edited an anthology of Indian poetry in Hindi. So I have, and there are, as I said, several anthologies in Malayalam also. I enjoy editing poetry, reading poetry, and choosing the best of them and putting them together in collections. I think that is something, as you suggested. I think this will be very useful for the new generation to understand, poetry in their language, poetry in other languages, in India and abroad.
Yeah, surely they are useful for the young readers. I want to know your views on the present situations like war, riots, and fighting on many reasons, and political issues, issues of our country, and how they are influencing a poet.
Yeah, of course. I don't, because one of the jobs of any poet is to speak truth to power. I mean, the poet should be completely fearless. That is one of the major qualities I expect from any honest poet. The poet should be fearless. He may be arrested, he may be shot dead, he may be put in a prison, but he should go on telling the truth for the people, for the benefit of the people, for the benefit of the readers. So I believe if you are a truth teller, if you believe in truth, you have to say what is happening in the country, what is happening in the world today. Primarily, that is why many of my recent poems are about violence, various kinds of violence. There is patriarchal violence, that is violence performed by or perpetrated by men on women, which I call patriarchal violence, violence of the male, the male violence. And then there is political violence, because there are murders, political murders. You kill somebody because he or she does not agree with your opinion. You know there were so many murders in the recent years also. Gauri Lankesh was killed, Kalburgi was killed, Pansare was killed, Dhabolkar was killed, just because some people could not agree with their views, political views or social views, and so they were simply murdered. And some people were murdered because they belonged to a religion that these people did not like. Maybe they were Muslims, maybe they were Christians, as in Kanthamal, or Muslims, as in Gujarat. So you found a lot of genocides, not even one person, but sometimes hundreds of people were killed. And so in India, it is happening, and it is happening also in the world. You look at the Russia-Ukraine war that is happening now. So many, and it is not that the soldiers are killing soldiers, but even ordinary people, mothers and children, are not spared. Even they are killed in a war. So I, as a poet, stand against war, every war, whatever reason you say. I say there is no logic in war at all. So I have written a lot of poems about against war, right from a poem called Hiroshima, and later against many wars that were held here and elsewhere. So I am against war. I am against violence of every kind. That is what Gandhi taught me. That is what the Buddha taught me. That is what Christ taught me. These are figures whom I very much respect. So all of them have taught me the value of non-violence. So I disagree with every kind of violence. You can have a debate. You can have a meaningful conversation, but a debate should not end in the murder of the other person. Then there is no scope for debate, because death means silence. There is no conversation. So I believe in conversation. I believe in dialogue. I believe in debate, but not in violence, not in murder. And that was the great lesson that Gandhi taught us. And also Srinarayana Guru of Kerala, a great sannyasin, he also taught us the same thing. We can argue, we can have a dialogue, but we should not harm the other person just because we think that he is our enemy, or she is our enemy, or they are our enemies. So there are no enemies. We may have different opinions, but that's the different thing. Just because they hold an opinion different from you, it does not mean that you can easily just destroy that person or kill that person. So I am primarily against violence, and violence comes from different sources today. As I said, it can be the male power, it can be political power, it can be the power of globalization, the power of the empire, or the power of countries like the United States. So it can be technological power, the power of technocracy, which destroys the environment in the name of development. So there are many kinds of violence happening, not only violence upon human beings, but violence on nature also. In the name of development, we are destroying our forests and our mountains and our rivers. And so that means we are depriving our children of what we have inherited from our fathers and grandfathers. We should hand over to our children an earth which is better than what we inherited from our fathers. That's what I believe. But unfortunately, we are going to give them an earth that is much worse, or a planet that is not even as good as it was when we got it. So we should, all poets, I believe, should stand up against violence, and that's the primary thing. One can go on talking about various kinds of violence, but primarily poetry stands against violence.
Yes. According to you, is a poem a quest? And if yes, then what is the quest of a poetry?
Yes, as I have already, in some sense, mentioned, it's a quest for truth, and at the same time, a quest for beauty. So, what makes poetry distinct is this combination of truth and beauty. Of course, John Keats, the British Romantic poet, had already said it: truth is beauty, and beauty is a truth. And I think there is some truth in what he said, because any good poet is looking for truth, but he is not looking for truth like an essayist or a theorist or a philosopher. He is also looking for beauty. So he writes poetry. When he writes poetry, he creates a new kind of beauty, and he also tells you some new kind of truth, which I have tried to do, and many poets are trying to do, to combine these two qualities of truth and beauty. I think these are the major quest or the motives for the poet's quest.
Yeah. You have been a translator too. How important is the translation in the contemporary Indian literature, according to you?
Yes, in a multilingual country like India, I think translation is extremely important, because I will not know what is happening in Tamil or in Kannada or in Telugu, which are all South Indian languages. Even then, I will not understand unless they are translated into my language or into any language that I understand. Maybe Hindi, maybe English, other languages that I know. And similarly, what is happening in Hindi, what is happening in Rajasthani, what is happening in Dogri or in Kashmiri or in Bhojpuri, whatever language you can name, Assamese or Bengali or Marathi. So to understand what is happening in those languages, I need to get translations of their best poetry, their best fiction, their best criticism. So, translation plays a very important role in connecting people, in bringing people together, in making me understand what is happening in another language. Not only literature, but I will say culture, because translation is a cultural bridge or a cultural link between people. In order to understand Bengali culture, I should understand Bengali literature. If I read a good Bengali novel by Asha Purna Devi or Mahashwada Devi or Sunil Gangobadhyay, or Manik Bandopadhyay or Tarashankar Banerjee, through that I know what is Bengali culture, what is their way of living, what is their way of thinking, how do they react to various things happening around them. So, to understand a culture, to understand a people, you need to understand their literature. So, when you translate a novel or a collection of poetry, you are also translating a culture, and bringing that culture closer to your own culture and your own language. So translation performs this function of bringing languages and cultures together. And I think in a country like India, as I already said, it is very important because we have so many languages. We have 24 languages recognized by the constitution, and there are at least 600 languages in India, and maybe perhaps more. Some are called dialects, some are called tribal languages. Whatever they are called, they are all languages. And so, unless there is translation, we will never understand this country. We will never understand what is happening in other languages, and we will never understand the contribution that every language and every culture and every region is doing to our culture. So, we need to know other languages and other cultures in order to understand a multilingual country like India, particularly because in the language landscape of India is even bigger than that of Europe. Europe has only say a few languages, 10 or 12 languages, but India has 600 or more languages, and so to understand India is even more difficult, and so you need a translation in order to understand it.
Yeah. The new generation is inclined towards the new mediums of entertainment rather reading the literature or the books. According to you, how this affects the way the new generation of the poetry or the future of the poetry?
In fact, poetry was always a minority art. I don't think of a time when everybody read poetry and everybody enjoyed poetry. Of course, there was a time perhaps of bhakti poetry. See, when Kabir sang his songs, or Kabir or Mirabai or Tukaram or Lal Ded or Andal, or there were thousands of bhakti poets all over India in all the languages. and they did not write their poems; they only sang. It was oral tradition, and perhaps at that point of time, people listened to poetry. But now, after poetry began to be written rather than recited or sung, then only those who are literate, only those who know the language can read poetry. So the readers of poetry became smaller. Earlier, there were, because they needed only to listen to what was being recited or sung. But now they had to read, and in order to read, they have to study. They have to know the language. So, and now you find, as you very well said, the young generation is very much interested in entertainment, in serials, and they spend most of their time on the mobile, playing on it, or they do video games. And there's a lot of time is sometimes used, sometimes wasted. I will not say all time is wasted, because sometimes they may be doing useful things also. But in order to read poetry, you need concentration, you need some kind of focusing. But a new generation very often does not have that kind of concentration, because after 1 minute of reading a book, reading one page, then they again go back to the mobile and look at the mobile. So you need concentration to read a book, and poetry needs even more concentration than a novel or something else, because it is a very dense use of language that you find there. And so there is a lack of concentration. But at the same time, I should tell you, the new media have also helped poets, because earlier they needed to send it to an editor of a magazine to get it published. But now they can publish it themselves. They can put it on the Facebook. They can open a blog, or start a blog, and write their poems on the blog. They can read the poem to a friend on the mobile. So it has also helped poetry in a way. There are so many poets now. If you just open the internet, or you will find so many poets writing poetry. Even in my language, there are now literally thousands of poets who are writing poetry. But the question is right, because there are many more poets writing now. But are there more readers reading now? That is a very difficult question, because I am not sure all these poets are read by so many people. Only very often only their immediate friends read them, and they put a like, or they say this is world class poetry, etc. But they are not often world class. It's only an exaggeration. So they are also misled by that kind of praise. They think they are writing great poetry even when they are not writing really good poetry. So it has both the aspects. One good aspect, they can write anywhere, they can write anything. One bad aspect, because they never know that they are writing bad poetry, because nobody tells them. They all the friends tell them they are writing great poetry. That's the problem.
Yeah. What were the reason that you started literary criticisms? You were a poet, translations. So, what were the reasons that you started writing the essays on literary criticisms?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question, because when we started writing, that was in the 1960s. At that point of time, we were writing a new kind of poetry, what is often called modern poetry today. Nayi Kavita in Hindi, Nayi Kavita, and in every language it has its own name, different names, but all of them mean practically new poetry or modern poetry. So this was a different kind of poetry. We were using a new language. We were using new kinds of images, with which readers were not very familiar. We were using new rhythms, sometimes using folk rhythms, sometimes using meter, sometimes not using meter at all, and writing in prose. So we were creating a new language, writing a new kind of poetry. And so I needed to fill the gap, or to bridge the gap between the writer and the reader. So we had only very few readers in the beginning, because they said, "Oh no, we don't like it, or we don't understand your poetry." So I wanted them to understand not only my poetry, but also the poetry of other people who were writing with me, or who were just senior to me. Ayyappa Panikar, and we had a whole generation of first generation modern poets. I belong to the second generation of modern poets in Malayalam. So I wanted all of us to be understood by readers, and that is how I began writing criticism. I began to write about modern poetry. What is modern poetry? What is modernism? What are the influences of poets and other traditions on modern poetry? And what is it that Ayyappa Panikar is trying to say? What is it that I am trying to say? So I began to write about modern poetry, and I want to create a new readership for the new poetry. And I think not only I, many people tried. We also had many poetry reading sessions where many people would gather and we would read our poetry. Sometimes we also performed our poetry. Sometimes we used costumes and makeup and so because we wanted them to understand poetry and come close to us. So we did all that, and criticism to me was also a way of making them understand what we are trying to do. So that was how I started writing criticism. Even though later I began to write also about fiction, about drama, even about film and painting and other arts. But primarily, I began to write criticism so that our poetry will be understood by the existing readers of poetry who are familiar only with old kinds of poetry. I wanted them to understand new poetry.
Yeah, you're one of the famous anthology that is a collection of essays or writings, the myths in the contemporary literature. I want to know what are the myths in the contemporary literature that you find now in the poets of the young generation or in the generation which is going on.
Yeah, that is a book I edited actually, in which I also have contributed an important essay, introductory essay. So, myths have always influenced poetry because myths can be interpreted in various ways. Say if you look at the story of Rama and Sita, or the story of Mahabharata, or various kinds of legends associated with various kinds of gods and other things, stories from the Puranas. So they are used by every generation in very different ways. They can be because the say the I began speaking about Kumaran Ashan. One of his famous poems is about Sita, but that is a different Sita, because there Sita is very critical of Rama because Rama had abandoned her, given her up, thrown her in the forest, and so she is very critical. She is thinking, why did Rama do that? Rama is the very incarnation of dharma. He is a great king. He was a very loving husband. Why did he do this? So she thinks about Rama in her own way. So this is how myth is used. So myth can be used in many ways. Sometimes you can also question existing myths in from different angles. For example, in Dalit poetry, you find a lot of poems on Ekalavya. Ekalavya is treated as a hero because he was cheated. His thumb was cut off, and he could not use the kind of vidya that he had learned. So he becomes a hero, and Sita becomes a heroine in many feminist poets. And so or Shambhuga also is often you find Shambhuga reappearing in Dalit poetry and Shudra poetry, because Shambhuga was killed only because he was a Shudra, and he started penance which was not allowed for the Shudras. So myth can be used in many ways, interpreted in many ways, and so they will continue to influence poets of all time, and poets will interpret these myths in their own ways in order to reveal the truth of their time. So it is not the old myth they're reproducing. They are not reproducing the old myth. They are interpreting the myth in their own way to suit their own time and their own personal and social needs.
I want to talk one question. I want to ask one question and talk on one issue that is very frequent now, I would say. For that reason only, we are having this online interview. How did you manage writing this Corona time, and how was your lockdown time? What you did in that lockdown?
Yeah, strangely, I lost a lot of very good friends to COVID. One was Manglesh Dabral himself, about whom I spoke earlier, a very great Hindi poet and a very, very intimate friend. I lost several other friends in Kerala and in Delhi and in many other parts of India during COVID. So it was a very sad time when I look at it personally. At the same time, because during COVID, I was not invited to public programs. There were no public programs, even though I had online programs. I had online readings, online lectures, and all that. But it gave me a lot of time, a lot of leisure. And I used that leisure to do two things other than online programs and all that. One is translating poetry. I have always been a translator. I have about more than 2000 pages of poetry in translation in Malayalam. And now I began translating Bhakti poetry and Sufi poetry. I was always interested in Bhakti poetry. I have written a lot about Bhakti poetry, given lectures in Banaras Hindu University, etc., on Bhakti poetry, because Bhakti poets were actually revolutionaries, spiritual revolutionaries, because they questioned priesthood, they questioned the caste system and the Varna system, and they wrote in their own languages and not in Sanskrit. So, in many ways, they were rebels. They wanted an equal, egalitarian society. They wanted a new kind of society where everybody was equal. There was no gender discrimination. There was no caste distinction. They wanted a human, more humane kind of society. And that was how I was fascinated by the Bhakti poets. So I had written about them earlier, but now I began translating them. I began with Kabir, whom I admire a lot, and that has come out as a book. It is called in Malayalam Deivavummayulla Sambhashanangal, which means conversations with God. That is the title of that book. It is a book of selected poems of Kabir. I translated directly from the original. I could do that. I have enough Hindi to know some old Hindi also, so I could easily translate Kabir directly into Malayalam. That is the beginning. And then I went on to translate the Kannada Bhakti poets, Basavanna, Akka Mahadevi, 4 Shaiva poets. And I brought them together in one book. It is called Shivoham. So that is the second book I brought out during the COVID. And thirdly, I translated Tukaram, the Marathi Bhakti poet. And that is one book, Tukaram's poetry. And the fourth book, I thought, I will bring many poets together. There are 50 Bhakti poets together from different languages brought in a single book. And fifthly, I also translated Bulle Shah, the great Punjabi Sufi poet. So these 5 books came out, or 3 books have come out, 2 are now in press. All these were translated during the COVID time. So that is one of the main things I did. I also was writing poetry. I had 2 collections of poetry during this time, and I had many essays also, and gave many online lectures and readings. That was how I spent it. So that way, it was a very fruitful time for me. It was a very painful time, but it was also a very fruitful time for me.
Yeah. So it seems spirituality in you, and how do you see this spirituality on religion in which our country people are fighting on the social issues like that religion or riots are being there? So how do you see that?
I think they have not understood religion at all, because spirituality stands for unity, love, fraternity, and equality of all human beings. Because if God is the creator of all human beings, all human beings are the sons of the daughters of the same father. So there cannot be any distinction, whatever you be, your caste, or because it is an accident. You were born in a particular family, in a Brahmin family or a Shudra family or a Dalit family. That is just an accident. You could have been born in some other family also. So we should not think that these accidents are very important and worship those accidents. So if you are really spiritual, you will not kill, you will not hate, because no real spiritual guru, will teach you to hate other people. They will only tell you to love other people. And spirituality means love of all human beings, not only human beings, love of animals, love of birds, and love of trees, love of the whole nature, the whole universe. That is the spirit of the ultimate meaning of spirituality. So if you are really spiritual, you cannot use religion for political purpose or gaining power or killing somebody or hating somebody. So they are not religious. According to me, they are not religious at all. They are enemies of religion. whether they are Muslim or Hindu or Christian or whatever. If they are if they are if they are spreading hatred, they are not religious, they are not spiritual, they are against the spirit of humanity, and so I would say they have not understood. So so communalism is religion without spirituality, religion minus spirituality. When spirituality goes, religion becomes just a power institution. You can gain power using that, you can rise in politics and all that. That is not the original purpose. Buddha has never said that, Christ has never said that, even Krishna has not said that. So nobody said that religion should be used for gaining political power or hating other people. So hatred is against the very spirit of spirituality and the spirit of religion. So I would say they have not understood religion at all.
Yeah, this is the moment of the talk show. I think so. The viewers and I also was eagerly waiting to this the poem recitation. So I request you to recite some of your poems in Malayalam as well as in English.
Okay. You had wanted me to read the poem The Mad, so I will read that first. The mad have no caste nor religion. They transcend gender, live outside ideologies. We do not deserve their innocence. Their language is not of dreams, but of another reality. Their love is moonlight. It overflows on the full moon day. Looking up, they see gods we have never heard of. They are shaking their wings when we fancy they are shrugging their shoulders. They hold even flies have souls, and the green god of grasshoppers leaps up on thin legs. At times they see trees bleed, hear lions roaring from the streets. At times they watch heaven gleaming in a kitten's eyes, just as we do. But they alone can hear ants sing in a chorus. While patting the air, they are taming a cyclone over the Mediterranean. With their heavy tread, they stop a volcano from erupting. They have another measure of time. Our century is their second. 20 seconds and they reach Christ. 7 more, they are with the Buddha. In a single day, they reach the Big Bang at the beginning. They go on walking restless, for their earth is boiling still. The mad are not mad like us. That is the poem, The Mad. I'll read a poem called Loving a Woman. To love a woman is to resurrect her from stone, to fondle her from tip to toe until her blood, frozen by curse, is warmed by a dream. To love a woman is to turn her soot laden day into a skylark that breathes the flower dust of paradise, to turn oneself into a tree in bloom for her tired wings to rest at night. To love a woman is to set sail on a storm swept sea under an overcast sky in search of a new continent, to carry a red balsam from your front yard to an unseen shore and plant it there. To love a woman is to exchange the harshness of your muscles for the tenderness of a flower, to free yourself of the armor and a crown, bear, cross another sky, and leave your flesh to the winds of another planet, to another water. To love a woman is to help her unearth a rare sharp sword from her ancient scars and lie pressing your heart on its blade until you are drained of all your blood. I have never loved a woman. Now, Shall I'll read a very short poem called Self, and then read one poem in Malayalam. Self. My mother didn't believe when in 1945 I appeared to her in a dream and told her I would be born to her the following year. My father recognized me as soon as he saw the mole below my left thumb. But mother believed to the very end that someone else had been born to her, masquerading as me. Father and I pleaded with her, but dreams are not reliable witnesses. She went on waiting for that promised son till she died. Only when she was reborn as my daughter did she admit it had really been me. But by then, I had begun to doubt it was someone else's heart that was beating within my body. One day, I will retrieve my heart, my language too. You wanted me to read the poem Gandhi and Poetry in Malayalam, in the original. I will read that, and if we have time, I will read the English translation also. In the Malayalam first, Gandhiyum Kavithayum. This is a meeting between Gandhi and poetry. Poetry is personified here, standing before Gandhi. ഗാന്ധിയും കവിതയും. ഒരു ദിവസം മെലിഞ്ഞ ഒരു കവിത ഗാന്ധിയെ കാണാൻ ആശ്രമത്തിലെത്തി. കുനിഞ്ഞിരുന്ന് രാമനിലേക്കുള്ള നൂൽ നൂൽക്കുകയായിരുന്നു ഗാന്ധി. താനൊരു ഭജനയാകാത്തതിൽ ലജ്ജിച്ച് വാതിലിൽ തന്നെ നിന്ന കവിതയെ ഗാന്ധി ആദ്യം ശ്രദ്ധിച്ചില്ല. കവിത മുരടനക്കിയപ്പോൾ ഗാന്ധി നരകം കണ്ട തന്റെ കണ്ണടയിലൂടെ ഇടം കണ്ണിട്ട് നോക്കി ചോദ്യം ആരംഭിച്ചു. എപ്പോഴെങ്കിലും നൂൽ നൂറ്റിട്ടുണ്ടോ? തോട്ടിയുടെ വണ്ടി വലിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടോ? വെളുപ്പിന് എണീറ്റ് അടുക്കളയിലെ പുകയേറ്റിട്ടുണ്ടോ? എപ്പോഴെങ്കിലും പട്ടിണി കിടന്നിട്ടുണ്ടോ? കവിത പറഞ്ഞു, ജനിച്ചത് കാട്ടിലായിരുന്നു, ഒരു നായാടിയുടെ വായിൽ. വളർന്നത് മുക്കുവത്തിയുടെ കുടിലിലും. എങ്കിലും പാട്ടല്ലാതെ ഒരു തൊഴിലും അറിയില്ല. കുറക്കാലം പാട്ടുപാടി കൊട്ടാരങ്ങളിൽ കഴിഞ്ഞു. അന്ന് വെളുത്തു കൊഴുത്തിരുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ തെരുവിലാണ്, അരവയറിൽ. ഗാന്ധി പുഞ്ചിരിച്ച് പറഞ്ഞു, ഈ ഒടുവിൽ പറഞ്ഞ കാര്യം നല്ലത് തന്നെ. പക്ഷേ സംസ്കൃതം പറയുന്ന ശീലം മുഴുവൻ ഉപേക്ഷിക്കണം. വയലിലേക്ക് ചെല്ലൂ, കർഷകർ സംസാരിക്കുന്നത് ശ്രദ്ധിക്കൂ. കവിത ഒരു വിത്തായി രൂപം മാറി വയലിലെത്തി. പുതുമഴ പെയ്ത് നിലമുഴുതുമറിക്കാൻ കൃഷിക്കാരൻ എത്തുന്ന ദിവസവും കാത്ത് കിടന്നു. That is the Malayalam, and if I have time, I will read the English translation also for those.
One of your poems of Malayalam that you have wrote in a folk song like.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have it with me just now
Achha.
because I'm upstairs and my books are downstairs. So,
No, any of your Malayalam poems, and then yeah.
Okay, I'll read one more. I write also in meter sometimes. So I'll read a poem which is written in meter. Sorry. I have several poems on house because I lived in many houses and I have a poem for every house. And this poem is in Malayalam. It is written in meter. It is called the last poem about house. വീടിനെ കുറിച്ചുള്ള അവസാനത്തെ കവിത. And this was written when I heard that the home we had built in Kerala, we had sold it to somebody, and that man bulldozed the whole house. When I heard it, I was terribly shocked and sad. And this poem speaks about that pain. And also, symbolically, it speaks about the condition of the country of India, which is also like a house now being bulldozed and ruined. ഏതു കന്മഴു ഇന്നെൻ നെഞ്ചിന്മേൽ പതിക്കുന്നു, ഏതു കാരിരുമ്പിന്റെ കമ്പി എൻ മൂർധാവിന്മേൽ, ഏതു കൈ വിദഗ്ധമായിടിച്ചു പൊളിക്കുന്നു, ഏറെ വീർപ്പിനാൽ ഏറെ വേർപ്പിനാൽ ഞങ്ങൾ പണിതോരീ വീടിപ്പോൾ, ഇതു ഞങ്ങൾ തൻ കണ്ണീർ ചെളിയിൽ പണിതത്, ഇതു ഞങ്ങൾ തൻ ഇച്ഛാദാർഢ്യത്താൽ ഉറച്ചത്, ഇതു ഞങ്ങൾ തൻ സ്നേഹം വെൺകളിയടച്ചത്, ഇത് ഞങ്ങൾ തൻ സ്നേഹം വെൺകളി അടിച്ചത്, ഇത് പൊന്നുണ്ണിക്കാൽകൾ വിശുദ്ധി അണച്ചത്, ഇത് നീതിതൻ വെള്ളിപ്പുലരിയൊരുക്കുവാൻ ഇരുളിൽ കിരണങ്ങൾ തീർത്തുണർന്നിരുന്നത്, ഋതുഭേദങ്ങൾ കരങ്ങ് ഉന്മാദത്തിനു തെരുവ്, ഇടിമിന്നലുകൾക്കു സത്രം, ഓർമ്മകൾക്കിതൊരിലതൻ കൂട്, മഴക്കുടപ്പൻ നാടിൻ പച്ചമുഴങ്ങും പുള്ളോർക്കുടം, മാറ്റത്തിൻ മുന്നൂർക്കുടം, കല്ലടർത്തുമ്പോൾ ചീറ്റും അച്ഛൻ്റെ നിൽക്കാച്ചോര, അമ്മതൻ മുറിയല് തറപൊട്ടിക്കത്തേങ്ങും, എന്മുറി പൊളിക്കുമ്പോൾ അഗ്നിയും പ്രേതങ്ങളും, കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങളുടെ അറയ്ക്കകമോ തേനും നോവും, വീഴുമീ അടുക്കള നിറച്ചും ഒരു പെണ്ണിൻ നീറലും വാത്സല്യവും പുകയും കിനാക്കളും, ആ വരാന്തയിൽ അയൽക്കാരുടെ ഉദ്വേഗങ്ങൾ, ഈ വരാന്തയിൽ സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾ തൻ സംവാദങ്ങൾ, ഈ ചുവരിടിക്കുക കേഴട്ട കല്ലാശാരി, പൊയ്ക്കണക്കുകളോർത്തു മാഴ്കെട്ട പെരുന്തച്ഛൻ, കഥകിൽ പതുങ്ങേണ്ടതില്ലിനി പാതിച്ചന്ദ്രൻ, തിരനോക്കേണ്ട ജനലരികിൽ മഴത്താടി, വെട്ടുക മാവും തെങ്ങും നികത്തൂ കാശിത്തുമ്പത്തോട്ടവും, പറിച്ചെറിഞ്ഞർക്കുകി പനിക്കൂർക്ക, മുറ്റവും കുളം തോണ്ടൂ കുളിക്കൂ തായ് നെഞ്ചിന്റെ രക്തത്തിൽ, മാറ്റിയിടുവിനന്യരായൻ മക്കളെ, പകുത്തൂ പലകുറി മണ്ണ് പോരെന്നാകിൽ പകുക്കൂ വീണ്ടും, ഭ്രാതൃഹത്യയെ വാഴ്വിൻ സൗഖ്യം, വാക്കുകളെല്ലാം പേയായി മാറുമ്പോൾ, മൊഴിയൊക്കെ വിൽക്കുമ്പോൾ, ഇരുട്ടിന്റെ മഷിയാൽ എഴുതിടാം, കന്മഴു പനയോലയാക്കി ഞാൻ ഇരുമ്പിന്റെ കമ്പിയാൽ ഒരു മഹാഭാരത കഥ വീണ്ടും, ഇരുമ്പിന്റെ കമ്പിയാൽ ഒരു മഹാഭാരത കഥ വീണ്ടും. That is a poem written in meter, because I also use various kinds of forms, metrical forms, folk forms, and also very modern prose forms.
Yeah, fabulous poems, and it was very good to listen them live from you. It was most good when we heard it physically, but yeah, the feelings were very good for us. Now at the end, I would request you to show your library. The books are peering with very wistfully from the should say the glasses of your shelves. So you can suggest some books to the young generations of the poet, as well as show your library.
Yeah, in fact, my library is spread all over this house. This has, in every room I have a small library. I am sitting upstairs. Downstairs I have four shelves of poetry, and upstairs I have 5, 6 shelves in three rooms. And I will show you this particular room. This is my study where I am sitting, and I will just take you round this study. Uh, this is one big shelf of books where I have my books of philosophy, books of history, books of theory and literary criticism, and all that. And then I have another shelf here. This first shelf has Indian fiction, and the other small shelf has European fiction. I have also uh, some fiction just it is behind me. That is
Yes.
they are my favorite novels, and then I have another shelf close to me. Yeah, this particular shelf, this has mainly Malayalam poets and Malayalam poetry. So this is only one room, and there are many rooms like this. Every room has it is a house of books. Actually, I am only we two people are living in this house of books. The books have allowed us to live in this house. That is all I can say. And if you want me to recommend some books for young readers and young poets, I would say, for example, one of the poets I very much love and who has inspired me is Pablo Neruda. And it will be wonderful to have to read a book like this. These are the complete poems of Pablo Neruda. Not complete, but it's a big selection, as you can see. It's a big book. So Pablo Neruda. So read Pablo Neruda. Read the poems of Rilke, German poems. There are many translations available, and also Paul Celan, who is a very important German poet. And then read French poets like, especially Baudelaire, and poets like Mallarmé. And then there are, of course, there are thousands of poets, because I have a whole poetry library in 4 shelves, so I cannot name all of them. And there is also Cesar Vallejo, who is a very major poet from Peru, whom I like a lot. So these are some poets I recommend. Also in India, you should read if you know Hindi, you should read, of course, Kumar Narayan, Kedarnath Singh, Mangash Dabral, and many other. There are Anamika. There are quite a few very good contemporary poets writing in Hindi. And then there are Gujarati poets like Siddhamshu Yashchandra, Marathi poets like Dilip Chitre and Arun Koladkar, whom I respect a lot. He wrote in Marathi and also in English. And Navakant Barua and Nilmani Fukan in Assam. Then Sunil Gangobathai, Shankho Ghosh, etc. in Bengali. Vishnu Dey also in Bengali. So I can, from every language, I can cite the names of poets. So there is no point in giving so many names. So I have given some names of poets. And also read the works of Romila Thapar. If you're interested in history, you should read
Yes.
Irfan Habib. You should read Romila Thapar. Especially Romila Thapar's recent books are very important. He has a book called Dissent, which is about the tradition of argument in India. It's an old tradition. We were always arguing people, not killing people. We argued, we debated, we had a different viewpoint, different systems of thought. So that is a very good book. And there are several other books written about contemporary India, and also about these and Amartya Sen's Argumentative Indian is also an equally good book to understand our tradition of dialogue and argument. I think to understand that tradition is very important today. One can go on, because I have a whole shelf of books of philosophy and history and theory. I will not go into all that, but I think as a beginning, these books should be good enough.
Yes. At last, I would request you if you can read one of your poems that of your favorite poet that you like the most or influenced you the most.
Okay, yeah. Because I have this book of Pablo Neruda with me, I will read one of Neruda's poems. It is one of his early poems, actually. Of course, he wrote different kinds of poetry throughout his life. And his first book was called 20 Poems of Love and One Poem of Despair. And this is one of the love poems I am reading, the 14th love poem. Every day you play with the light of the universe. Subtle visitor, you arrive in the flower and the water. You are more than this white head that I hold tightly as a cluster of fruit every day between my hands. You are like nobody, since I love you. Let me spread you out among yellow garlands. Who writes your name in letters of smoke among the stars of the south? Oh, let me remember you as you were before you existed. Suddenly the wind howls and bangs at my shut window. The sky is a net crammed with shadowy fish. Here all the winds let go sooner or later, all of them. The rain takes off her clothes. The birds go by, fleeing. The wind, the wind. I can contend only against the power of men. The storm whirls dark leaves and turns loose all the boats that were moved last night to the sky. You are here. Oh, you do not run away. You will answer me to the last cry. Cling to me as though you were frightened. Even so, at one time a strange shadow ran through your eyes. Now too, little one, you bring me honeysuckle, and even your breasts smell of it. While the sad wind goes slaughtering butterflies, I love you, and my happiness bites the plum of your mouth. How you must have suffered getting accustomed to me, my savage, solitary soul, my name that sends them all running. So many times we have seen the morning star burn, kissing our eyes, and over our heads the grey light unwinds in turning fans. My words rained over you, stroking you. A long time I have loved the sunned mother of pearl of your body. I go so far as to think that you own the universe. I will bring you happy flowers from the mountains, bluebells, dark hazels, and rustic baskets of kisses. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. I want to do with you what the spring does with the cherry trees. That is one of the early love poems of Pablo Neruda.
Fabulous, sir. Fabulous.
Thank
It's really an honor for me to have an interview with you, and it was a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you to again you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uday.